Shabbat Shalom. It's lovely to see you all this evening. I want to begin, before I speak some words of Torah, just to acknowledge and thank Shar Zion Beth-El for all of the hard work that's gone into bringing Judith and me here. We've been welcomed with open arms. Truly, the hospitality and graciousness, and I have to say, great sense of humor has been just lovely, and we're very, very grateful to the community for inviting us here to be with you. I will also share, I've been in this beautiful room before. I was here for the Rabbinical Assembly meeting that was roughly 5 years ago, something like that. And now I've dove into the morning a few times, but my wife, Judith Schleyer, has never been in the building before this evening. And as Cantor Stodlin was singing so gorgeously, she just leaned over and said, "Wow, I love this space. It's amazing." And it is. It's really spectacular, and the acoustics are beautiful. So with that, I will proceed to share. Just my words tonight are quite brief. My sermon tomorrow is more substantial, I guess you'd say, and longer, but being Friday night. I will also say that my happy place is really schmoozing with congregants after meals, Kiddush lunch and dinner, so I'm really looking forward to talking and trying to get to know as many of you as I can. I'll do my very best to try and remember names. It might take me a little while, but be patient with me. The parasha this Shabbat is Acharei Mot Kedoshim. We're blessed to read a double parasha. And what I'd like to focus on is a kind of poignant tension that our parasha develops between life as it is and a more perfect vision of life as it could be, between sometimes the sorrows and disappointments of our experience in the world and a hope for a sense of shlemut, of closeness, a closeness to the divine, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the Holy One of Blessing. And this tension can be seen in thinking through. I want to think through something very central in our parasha and how it brings out this back and forth between what is and something more beautiful and optimistic, what could be. Sometimes I think we experience God quite intensely in our lives. I know when our two children came into the world, I think I felt this just palpable sense of God's presence. When Judith and I stood under the chuppah, I also felt it. But sometimes, of course, God can feel quite distant and even hidden from our experience. And a midrash testifies to this tension. It acknowledges it explicitly. And it reads, very short, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, Pe'amim matsui, Pe'amim eino matsui. Sometimes the Holy One is found, and sometimes God isn't found. Pe'amim karov, sometimes God is close. Pe'amim eino karov, and sometimes God is not close. Now, this is from the rabbis, the sages. The sages are acknowledging it's up and down. Sometimes we feel it, and sometimes we don't. In our parasha, in Acharei Mot Kedoshim, God's presence is palpable. The parasha describes the ritual of Yom Kippur, when the people of Israel is cleansed of its sins. In rabbinic understanding, this day of purification was also a day of intimate connection with God, which was epitomized in the moment in which the high priest would pronounce God's personal name, Shema Meforash, the Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, the four-letter name of God. Calling God by name indicated a closeness and intimacy, perhaps only experienced after one receives forgiveness from sin. How did this take place? According to the Mishnah, the priest would confess the sins of Israel, it's in our parasha, and then quote the following verse, again in our parasha. For on this day it will be atoned for you, to cleanse you of all your offenses. Before Hashem you shall be cleansed. Lifnei Hashem titaru. When the priest recited the end of the verse, he would then pronounce God's name as it was actually written and it was pronounced, something forbidden in all other circumstances. Just once a year, the only time. This was the dramatic moment of Yom Kippur described in Acharei Mot. Another Mishnah describes how when the priest pronounced God's actual name in Jerusalem, his voice was so loud that people heard it all the way in Jericho. It's quite far away. How would people react to hearing God's name? They would prostrate on the ground, right? This is something we do on Yom Kippur, go all the way down on the ground and recite the following. And we hear this is the line from the Mishnah. Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Blessed be the name of God's glorious kingship forever and ever. And again, we reenact this on Yom Kippur. The people reacted to hearing God's name with physical action. They bowed low to the ground, but also with a verbal response. They blessed the name of God. Indeed, in addition to this phrase, there are a number of similar liturgical phrases in our prayers that respond to hearing the name of God, even when it's not pronounced in its full original form, something only the high priest would do on Yom Kippur. They vary somewhat, these phrases, but all contain similar elements. Blessed name of God, and forever. And they all respond to hearing God's name in one form or another. But there's one exception to this pattern. One exception that you hear and maybe say, and in fact probably do say, many, many times. It's one of the most familiar lines in all of Jewish prayer. Right? And it begins and it goes as follows. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach Le'olam Elomeil Maya. Right? The line we say in every kind of Kaddish. May God's great name be blessed forever and ever. This response has all the elements of the response cited above, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, the word name, blessed, and forever. But there's one thing missing. The response comes without a mention of God's name to trigger its recital. God's name is never mentioned. We say it without God's name. Indeed, as I'm sure many of you know, God's name is missing entirely from the Kaddish. Yet we respond in the Kaddish as if we had heard God's name and reacted to it. It's a ki'ilu in Hebrew, an as if. It's as if we respond to God's name. In other words, the absence of God's name in the Kaddish is highlighted by this line, which seems so out of place without God's name immediately preceding it. Now, we take this for granted. We say the Kaddish all the time. But what it's supposed to do is spark in us a sense of acknowledgement, a bit of dissonance, weirdness, that we're saying this line even though God's name is missing. God's name is further accentuated when we note the biblical source. God's missing name in the Kaddish is emphasized when we note the biblical source of this response. Where does Yehei Shmei Rabbah come from? So it actually comes from the book of Daniel, Sefer Daniel. So there's a line in the second chapter which reads as follows. Daniel answered and said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. Leheve Shmei de Eloah Mevarach min Alma va'ad Alma. It's close, right? I hope it sounds a little familiar. What's missing in the Kaddish that this has? Eloha, right? The Hebrew name of God. Daniel says it. The Kaddish is missing it. And so this highlights the function of this phrase in the Kaddish. It indicates where we might expect God to be mentioned, God's name is conspicuously absent. So if this is true, how are we meant to experience the Kaddish when we say it? I think what we're meant to think of is that the Kaddish is a prayer that highlights our sense of the reality in which we dwell, where God's presence is often experienced as distant, or God forbid, even absent. In a world with suffering and brokenness, God can feel far away. Remember that line I read at the beginning? Eino karov. The rabbis acknowledge God is not close sometimes. This prayer, the Kaddish, built on a response to the name of God that is never uttered, gives voice to that feeling of distance. And indeed, this understanding of the role of Kaddish goes back very far to one of the earliest sources for the prayer, the Kaddish, from the Babylonian Talmud. And it's a very powerful story. It goes as follows. It is taught, Rabbi Yossi said, "One time I was walking on the path, and I entered a ruin from one of the ruins of Jerusalem in order to pray." So it's after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Eliyahu of blessed memory came and watched the doorway until I finished my prayer. Eliyahu said to me, "Whenever the Israelites go into the synagogue and schoolhouses and respond, Yehei Shmei Hagadol Mivorach," right? In most early manuscripts, it's usually replaced with Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivorach, as in the Kaddish. God shakes God's head and says, "Happy is the king who is thus praised in his house." Right? So whenever the Israelites go to pray, God is excited and happy and says, "Happy is the king who's praised." Woe to the father who had to banish his children, and woe to the children who had to be banished from the table of their father. On the one hand, when the phrase is recited by Israel in shuls and study houses, God is filled with happiness, just like in the days of the temple, when God was called by name. And yet it's not entirely parallel, because God's name is not recited. God's joy is tinged with grief. We live in a post-temple destruction world. So God goes on to say, "Woe is me, and woe is Israel." And so, this reflects the complex emotions when we say Yehei Shmei Rabbah in the Kaddish. The function of the Kaddish, again, right, was originally recited as a prayer following the study of Torah. It's true that we gain access to God to some extent through the study of Torah, but it's very different from the experience of hearing God's name and feeling God's palpable presence in Jerusalem. The prayer marks this shift. It eventually, of course, became a prayer for mourning. And its recitation by mourners highlights this. After all, it is a mourner who may feel distant, may feel distance from God most acutely. We no longer live in a world in which a high priest pronounces the name of God, as described in our parashah. We can't hear the name, and we can't react to God's presence as we once did. Both God and we mourn this situation. We yearn to be close to the divine. We yearn for a sense of completeness. The response in the Kaddish, recited even in the absence of that trigger, the mention of God's name, gives us a feeling of distance. And yet, even while we may experience God at a distance, we know that sometimes, Pa'amim karov, God is close. The Kaddish offers this hopeful aspect as well, envisioning and asking for a future time where God's presence is felt among all those on earth. Shabbat Shalom.